If he says my name tonight, I might survive this. That was the lie Ethan Whitmore kept repeating as he stood beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Harrington Grand Hotel, one hand folded over the other in front of his stomach, hiding the secret that had begun to round beneath his tailored cream coat. The ballroom glittered like a dream built for people who had never been hurt. Champagne glasses caught the light. Violins whispered from the balcony. Women in silk gowns and men in dark tuxedos smiled with the practiced ease of families who measured love in contracts and bloodlines. Ethan stood among them like a ghost pretending to breathe. 3 months ago, Caleb Harrington had held his hand in the greenhouse behind the Whitmore estate and promised, in a voice low enough for only the roses to hear, "When this is over, I'll choose you in front of everyone." Ethan had carried those words like a match in winter. He had believed them when his mother told him Omegas like him were born to be arranged, displayed, and traded. He had believed them when Caleb stopped answering his calls for 2 weeks. He had believed them even that morning, when the invitation arrived announcing a Harrington family declaration and his own name was nowhere on it. Now Caleb stood on the raised platform at the far end of the ballroom, 6 feet of polished alpha perfection in a black suit, his dark hair combed back, his blue eyes unreadable beneath the camera's soft flash. Beside him stood Madison Vale, golden, graceful, flawless, the kind of Omega every old money family approved of before she even opened her mouth. Ethan felt the room leaning toward them, hungry for romance, hungry for a clean story with clean people and clean endings. His fingers tightened over his stomach. Beneath his palm, there was no movement yet, only warmth, only the fragile truth of a life too small for the world to know about. Caleb's father raised a glass. The murmurs faded. Ethan's pulse became so loud he almost missed the first words. "Tonight, our families celebrate more than business." Laughter, soft and expensive, moved through the crowd. Caleb did not look at Ethan. Not once. "We celebrate legacy, loyalty. And the future of the Harrington name." Ethan's throat burned. He wanted to step forward. He wanted to say, "Caleb, please, not like this." But he had been trained his whole life to stay beautiful while breaking. Then Caleb took Madison's hand. The cameras flashed brighter. "I am honored to announce my engagement to Madison Vale." The applause struck Ethan like cold rain. For one impossible second, he thought he had heard wrong. Then people turned, because pain had a scent, and an Omega's heartbreak could fill a room faster than perfume. Caleb's gaze finally found him. Ethan hated the hope that still rose in him, small and foolish and starving. Caleb's jaw tightened. Madison's smile sharpened. Someone whispered his name. Ethan forced himself to speak, though his voice barely carried. "Caleb, what was I to you?" The question slipped into the silence like a dropped glass. Caleb stepped down from the platform, each movement controlled, each inch of distance between them watched by 100 curious eyes. When he reached Ethan, his scent of cedarwood and winter air wrapped around the old places in Ethan's heart that still remembered being loved. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought Caleb would take it back. Instead, Caleb looked at him as if they were strangers. "You were never meant to stand beside me." The words were quiet, but the room heard them. Ethan heard someone gasp. Someone else laughed under their breath. Heat climbed up his neck, then drained away, leaving him cold from the inside out. His hand pressed harder against his stomach, not to hide it anymore, but to protect what Caleb did not know he had just rejected. Ethan lowered his eyes before the tears could make him look weaker than he already felt. He wanted to disappear between the marble pillars, into the music, into the floor. But the baby beneath his palm was real, and for the first time that night, Ethan understood something with terrible clarity. Caleb had not only denied him in public. He had denied their child before ever knowing it existed. 3 months earlier, Ethan Whitmore still believed promises could be stronger than family names. The greenhouse behind the Whitmore estate was the only warm place. In a house built from marble, silence, and rules. Outside, late winter pressed against the glass in sheets of silver rain, turning the gardens into a blur of dark hedges and trembling lights. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth, white roses, and the faint sweetness of oranges growing in clay pots along the west wall. Ethan had escaped there after another dinner where his mother discussed his future as if he were not sitting at the table. He had been told to smile more softly, speak less directly, and remember that an Omega of the Whitmore line did not choose where he belonged. He was 19, old enough to understand the cage, but still young enough to dream of a door. Caleb Harrington found him sitting on the stone bench near the fountain, his black coat damp from the rain, his cedarwood and winter air scent cutting through the flowers before he even spoke. "You disappeared," Caleb said. Ethan did not look up. "I was dismissed." Caleb moved closer, careful and quiet, nothing like the cold air the newspapers loved to photograph. "By your mother?" Ethan laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "By the room. By the family. By every person who thinks I am just a polite answer waiting for the right alpha to ask the right question." Caleb sat beside him, leaving only a few inches between their shoulders. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped against the glass roof like hundreds of tiny fingers. Ethan stared at his own hands, pale and tense in his lap, and hated how badly he wanted Caleb to touch them. "You are not an answer," Caleb said at last. "You are the only honest thing in that entire house." Ethan turned to him then, startled by the softness in his voice. Caleb's blue eyes were usually guarded, trained by boardrooms and family expectations to reveal nothing, but in the greenhouse light they looked almost young. Almost afraid. "Do not say things like that unless you mean them," Ethan whispered. "I mean them." It was dangerous, how simply Caleb said it. Dangerous because Ethan had been lonely for so long that kindness felt like rescue. Dangerous because Caleb Harrington was not just any alpha. He was the heir to a family whose approval could lift the Whitmores back into power or crush them with one unsigned agreement. Ethan knew the rules. He knew Caleb was expected to bond with someone flawless, wealthy, and publicly useful. Someone like Madison Vale. Someone whose name would look beautiful beside his in a press release. Not Ethan, who was too quiet, too sheltered, too desperate to be seen as a person. But Caleb reached for his hand anyway, his thumb brushing over Ethan's knuckles with a gentleness that made Ethan forget the cold beyond the glass. "My father is pushing the Vale arrangement," Caleb admitted. "He thinks it will stabilize everything before the spring merger." Ethan's heart folded in on itself. "Then why are you here?" Caleb's fingers tightened around his. "Because when I am with them, I become what they built. When I am with you, I remember what I wanted before they taught me to want power." Ethan should have pulled away. Instead, he let the words settle into him like sunlight. Caleb turned fully toward him, his voice lower now, not secretive, but sacred. "Give me time. Let me fix this the right way. When this is over, I will choose you in front of everyone." Ethan searched his face for calculation, pity, hesitation, anything that might save him from believing. He found none. Only Caleb, looking at him as if the world had narrowed to the space between their hands. That was the moment Ethan gave him the most fragile part of his trust. Not all at once, not foolishly, but with the quiet surrender of someone who had been waiting his whole life to be chosen without being priced. He leaned his head against Caleb's shoulder, and Caleb rested his cheek lightly against Ethan's hair. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, the white roses trembled in the warm air. Ethan closed his eyes and imagined a future where he would not have to hide in greenhouses to be loved. He imagined Caleb standing before both families, his hand open, his voice steady, saying Ethan's name without shame. He imagined applause that did not wound. He imagined freedom wearing the face of an alpha who had promised him everything. Months later, in a ballroom filled with crystal and whispers, Ethan would remember that exact promise as Caleb looked through him like a stranger. But on that rainy night, Ethan believed him. That night became the memory Ethan would later return to with both tenderness and fear, because it was the night his life quietly divided into before and after. It happened at the Harrington Winter Charity Gala, held on the top floor of a private museum in downtown Chicago, where the windows rose 30 feet high and the city lights glittered below like fallen stars. Ethan had arrived with his family in a pale blue suit his mother chose because it made him look gentle, respectable, and easy to approve of. Caleb had been across the room all evening, surrounded by investors, board members, and relatives who spoke to him as if he were already a king. Ethan watched him from a careful distance, pretending to study the art on the walls while every part of him remained aware of Caleb's presence. Caleb looked perfect, polished, untouchable, but Ethan knew the difference between composure and restraint. He saw it in the tightness around Caleb's eyes, in the way his hand closed around his glass without drinking from it, in the faint sharpness of his cedarwood scent cutting through the expensive perfume and champagne. Something was wrong. Near midnight, after speeches and donations and hollow applause, Ethan slipped out onto a quiet terrace to breathe. The February air was freezing, sharp enough to sting his cheeks, but he welcomed it. Inside, everyone wanted something from someone. Outside, the city simply existed. He had only been alone for a minute when Caleb stepped through the glass door behind him. His black tie was loosened, his hair slightly disordered, and for once he did not look like the Harrington heir. He looked like a man carrying too much weight. "You should not be out here without a coat," Caleb said. Ethan turned, trying to smile. "You sound like you care." Caleb's expression softened in a way that hurt. "I do." The wind moved between them. Ethan should have asked why Caleb had ignored him all evening. He should have asked why Madison Vale had spent half the night at his side. Instead, he noticed the faint tremor in Caleb's breath and the strain in his voice. "Are you all right?" Caleb looked away toward the skyline. "My father announced the spring merger timeline tonight. He wants the engagement settled before the press conference." Ethan's chest tightened. "With Madison?" Caleb did not answer immediately, and that silence was almost worse than yes. Then he reached for Ethan's hand, not boldly, but like a man asking permission from the only person whose answer mattered. "I told you I would fix it. You also told me you needed time." Ethan's voice cracked despite his effort to keep it steady. "How much time does a promise get before it becomes a lie?" Caleb closed his eyes. When he opened them, the cold blue had broken into something raw. "I am scared," he admitted, so quietly the wind nearly stole the words. Ethan had never heard Caleb say that before. Not to anyone. Not even to himself. It took the anger out of him and left only the ache. He stepped closer, and Caleb's arms came around him with careful restraint, as if Ethan were something precious he was terrified of damaging. They stood that way beneath the winter sky, surrounded by the distant sounds of music and traffic, two people hidden from a world that had already begun deciding their lives without them. Nothing about that night was reckless in Ethan's memory. It was not a mistake made in darkness. It was a choice wrapped in trust, in whispered promises, in the fragile belief that love could survive pressure if both people held on tightly enough. Caleb walked him to a private sitting room away from the noise, where the fire was low and the city glowed beyond the windows. They talked for a long time. Caleb spoke of being raised to inherit before he was ever taught to want. Ethan spoke of feeling displayed more often than loved. When Caleb pressed his forehead gently to Ethan's, he said, "I do not want a life where I have everything except you." Ethan believed him because Caleb sounded less like an alpha making a claim and more like a boy asking not to be alone. By dawn, Ethan left with his heart full of impossible hope. He did not know that hope had already begun changing him in a way neither of them could see. Weeks later, when the first wave of dizziness came during breakfast, he blamed nerves. When the scent of coffee made his stomach turn, he blamed stress. When his body grew tender and tired, he blamed heartbreak waiting for Caleb's next call. But one morning, staring at two clear lines on a white plastic test in the locked bathroom of the Whitmore estate, Ethan understood the truth. That winter night had not ended when the sun rose. It had left a heartbeat behind. The ballroom did not become silent all at once. It quieted in layers, first the laughter nearest Ethan, then the murmurs by the champagne table, then the polite conversations near the marble columns, until even the violins from the balcony seemed to soften out of pity. Ethan stood in the center of it with Caleb's words still open inside him like a wound no one else could see. "You were never meant to stand beside me." He had imagined pain as something loud, something that would knock him to his knees, but this pain was strangely clean. It moved through him like ice water, taking his breath, numbing his fingers, sharpening every detail until the whole room became unbearable. Madison Vale's diamond bracelet flashed under the chandelier. Caleb's father watched from the platform with the approving stillness of a man who believed an inconvenience had just been handled. Ethan's mother stood near the front row, her face pale with humiliation, not because her son had been hurt, but because he had made the hurt visible. Ethan wanted to hate Caleb in that moment. He wanted anger to rise and protect him, wanted pride to carry him out with his head high, but love had not left quickly enough. It remained in small, pathetic pieces, in the memory of Caleb's hand over his in the greenhouse, in the low promise beside the winter terrace, in the way Caleb used to say his name as if it was the only word in the room that mattered. Now Caleb looked at him with a stranger's restraint. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold, and Ethan understood that Caleb had chosen an audience over the truth. Someone near the back whispered, "Poor thing." Another voice answered, "He must have misunderstood the alpha's attention." The words were soft, but they landed with cruel precision. Ethan's cheeks burned. He became aware of his cream coat, of the careful way it draped over his stomach, of his own hand still pressed too protectively there. He forced his arm to relax, terrified that the gesture had revealed too much. Madison stepped closer to Caleb, her smile gracious enough for cameras and sharp enough for Ethan alone. "This must be emotional for you," she said, her voice smooth and public. "Childhood attachments can feel larger than they are." The phrase rolled through the crowd like permission. People smiled again, relieved to have a prettier explanation. Ethan was not a betrayed lover. He was not someone Caleb had promised anything to. He was only a sheltered Omega who had mistaken kindness for destiny. That version was cleaner. Safer. Easier to applaud. Caleb did not correct her. That silence hurt more than the sentence he had spoken. Ethan looked at him one final time, searching for even a flicker of apology, but Caleb's expression remained locked behind years of Harrington discipline. Perhaps he was suffering. Perhaps he was trapped. Perhaps his father's empire had closed around him like a fist. Ethan knew all those excuses, because he had repeated them to himself for weeks. But as the cameras flashed again and Madison's hand settled neatly into Caleb's arm, Ethan realized excuses could not hold a baby, could not protect a secret, could not make public shame feel private. His stomach tightened with a small cramp of stress, not dangerous, but enough to make fear cut through the numbness. He breathed slowly, exactly as the private Omega physician had once taught him during etiquette health lessons, in through the nose, out through the mouth, shoulders relaxed, spine straight. Do not shake. Do not cry. Do not let them see where you are soft. His mother approached at last, heels clicking against the polished floor. "Ethan," Victoria Whitmore said under her breath, her smile frozen for the room. "You will leave now before you embarrass this family further." Ethan almost laughed. Further. As if the family had been the one abandoned under the chandeliers. As if the Whitmore name, not his heart, had been placed on display and dismissed. He nodded because refusing would only feed the room. He turned carefully, moving toward the exit with the measured grace he had been trained to perform since childhood. Every step felt longer than the last. The ballroom doors stood 20 feet away, then 15, then 10. Behind him, Caleb's father resumed his toast, his voice warm and victorious. Applause rose again, polished and bright. Ethan reached the hallway before the first tear fell. No one followed. Not his mother. Not Caleb. The corridor outside was lined with mirrors, each one catching a different version of him, pale face, wet eyes, trembling mouth, one hand returning to the hidden curve beneath his coat. In the reflection, he looked unbearably young. Ethan pressed his palm to his stomach and whispered so softly even the walls could barely hear, "I am sorry. He does not know about you." The apology broke something in him, but it also woke something else. A quieter strength. A colder one. Caleb had made his choice in front of everyone. Ethan would make his in silence. By the time Ethan returned to the Whitmore estate, the house was already asleep, or pretending to be. The mansion stood at the end of the long private drive like a white stone judgment, every window dark except the one in his mother's study, where a single lamp burned amber behind the curtains. He knew she was waiting. He also knew he could not survive another polished lecture about dignity, family reputation, and the damage his feelings had caused. So he entered through the side door near the service hall, moving quietly past the kitchen, past the silver trays left drying beside the sink, past the portraits of Whitmore ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow him with disappointment. His room was on the second floor, at the end of a hallway that smelled faintly of lilies and furniture polish. He locked the door behind him before his breath finally broke. The silence inside was different from the silence downstairs. This one belonged to him. It held his books, his sketches, his old sweaters, the small things his mother called clutter and he called proof that he existed. Ethan crossed to the mirror above his dresser and stood there without moving. Under the soft lamplight, his cream coat looked almost innocent. Elegant. Expensive. A perfect costume for an Omega who had been taught to vanish politely. His fingers shook as he unbuttoned it. One button. Then another. Then another. When the coat slipped from his shoulders and fell onto the chair, there was no hiding left. The white dress shirt beneath it stretched gently over the small curve of his stomach, not dramatic, not obvious to a stranger, but undeniable to him. 3 months. Maybe a little more. The doctor he had visited in secret on the far side of Chicago had spoken kindly, measuring dates, checking his pulse, confirming what Ethan already knew from the way his body had begun protecting itself before his mind caught up. The baby was healthy. Small, steady, real. Ethan lifted the hem of his shirt and stared at the bare curve beneath, his skin pale in the lamplight, his body no longer belonging only to grief. For weeks he had thought of the pregnancy as a secret, then as a crisis, then as evidence of a promise Caleb had broken. But standing there after the ballroom, after the whispers and Madison's smile and Caleb's terrible silence, Ethan saw something else. This was not a scandal. This was not a mistake. This was the only person in the world who had stayed with him through every humiliation without asking him to be useful, beautiful, or quiet. His palm settled over the curve with a tenderness that made his throat close. "My little star," he whispered, the name coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "I am still here." The words were meant for the baby, but they saved him too. He sank onto the edge of the bed, one hand on his stomach, the other covering his mouth as the sobs finally came. They were not graceful. They were not the soft, cinematic tears of a heartbroken Omega in a ballroom. They were messy and breathless and private, the kind of crying that stripped away every lesson about posture and restraint. He cried for the boy in the greenhouse who had believed a promise. He cried for the night in the museum when Caleb had looked scared and human and true. He cried for the version of himself who had stood under chandeliers and waited to be chosen by someone who chose power instead. When there were no tears left, the room looked sharper. The future looked sharper too. He could not stay here forever. His mother would notice the loose clothes, the morning sickness, the scent blockers hidden in his drawer. The Whitmores knew how to polish shame into strategy, and Ethan knew with sudden cold certainty that once they learned the truth, they would not ask what he wanted. They would ask how quickly the problem could be hidden. He stood and crossed to his closet. From the top shelf, behind a row of old winter scarves, he pulled down a small canvas bag. Into it he placed cash he had saved from birthday envelopes, a folded sweater, his identification, the clinic card, and the ultrasound photo tucked inside a plain white envelope. The image was blurry, almost impossible to understand, but Ethan had looked at it 100 times. A tiny shape. A beginning. A reason. Downstairs, a floorboard creaked. Ethan froze. Another sound followed, quieter, then his mother's voice beyond the hallway, low and controlled as she spoke to someone on the phone. "No, he does not know how much damage he has done yet." Ethan's hand closed around the envelope. He looked once more at the mirror, at the pale Omega with red eyes and a secret beneath his heart. For the first time, he did not see someone abandoned. He saw someone preparing to run. The voice outside Ethan's room did not rise, yet it filled the hallway with more force than shouting ever could. Victoria Whitmore had always believed anger was vulgar when control could cut deeper. Ethan stood beside his half-packed canvas bag, his fingers locked around the envelope that held the first picture of his child, and listened through the door as his mother spoke with the calm precision of someone arranging flowers for a funeral. "The Harrington situation is unfortunate, but not unrecoverable," she said. "Ethan is emotional. He has always been emotional. We will correct the narrative before morning." A pause followed, then the faint sound of her heels crossing the hallway. Ethan's breath shortened. Correct the narrative. In his family, those words meant erasing the person who did not fit the picture. He moved quickly, sliding the ultrasound envelope beneath the folded sweater in his bag, but before he could zip it shut, there was a knock. 3 soft taps. Polite. Final. "Open the door, Ethan." He closed his eyes for 1 second, placed both hands over his stomach, and forced his face into stillness before turning the lock. Victoria entered without waiting to be invited. She wore a pearl gray robe over her evening dress, her blonde hair still pinned perfectly from the party, her expression smooth except for the cold disappointment in her eyes. Behind her came a private physician Ethan had seen at family events, Dr. Elwood, carrying a slim black medical case. Ethan's blood went cold. Why is he here? Victoria glanced at the canvas bag on the bed, then at Ethan's loose shirt, then lower for just half a second. It was enough. "Because you have been ill," she said. "You have refused breakfast twice this week. You have avoided fittings. You nearly caused a scene tonight. We need to know whether this is stress or something more inconvenient." Ethan stepped back. "I am fine." "You are not fine. You are careless." The word landed softly, almost gently, and somehow that made it worse. Dr. Elwood cleared his throat, avoiding Ethan's eyes. It would only be a brief examination. Ethan's hand moved to his stomach before he could stop it. Victoria saw. The room changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But everything became colder. His mother's gaze sharpened with the terrible intelligence of a woman who had spent her life turning secrets into leverage. "How far along?" she asked. Ethan said nothing. The physician looked at the floor. Victoria inhaled slowly, as if Ethan had spilled wine on an heirloom rug instead of revealed a life beneath his heart. "Caleb Harrington?" she asked. Ethan's silence answered. For the first time that night, something like panic flickered behind her composure, but it was not concern for him. It was calculation colliding with disaster. She crossed to the window and looked out over the dark lawn. This cannot become public. Ethan felt the final thread between them snap. "That is your first thought?" Victoria turned back. "My first thought is that my son has placed himself, this family, and possibly the most important alliance we have ever had in an impossible position." "I did not place myself anywhere," Ethan whispered. "I trusted someone." "Then you were foolish." His eyes burned, but he refused to cry in front of her again. Dr. Elwood shifted uncomfortably. "Lady Whitmore, perhaps this conversation should wait until morning." "No. By morning, there will be staff gossip, phone calls, speculation. We act now." Victoria looked at Ethan as if he were a problem on paper. "There is an option. A discreet arrangement with an alpha whose name is respectable enough to absorb the scandal. The child can be presented as premature after a private ceremony out of state. You will cooperate. The word struck Ethan harder than any accusation. She was already building a cage for his baby. A new lie, a new owner, a new family story where Ethan's wishes were edited out before anyone heard them. No, he said. Victoria's expression froze. Excuse me. Ethan's voice shook, but it did not break. I said no. For a moment, even the house seemed to listen. The old Ethan would have apologized for the volume of his own breathing. The old Ethan would have folded under that stare, would have let duty dress itself as love. But the child beneath his palm changed the shape of fear. He was still afraid, terribly afraid, but not empty anymore. This baby is not a scandal for you to rename, he said. This baby is mine. Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping. You have no money, no protection, no claim Caleb Harrington will admit to. Do you understand what the world does to Omegas who mistake sentiment for security? Ethan looked toward the bed, toward the bag he had not finished packing, and understood with perfect clarity that waiting would cost him everything. He lowered his hand from his stomach and met his mother's eyes. Yes, he said softly. I understand what families do to them first. Victoria's face went pale. Ethan moved before she could answer, grabbing the canvas bag with one hand and the ultrasound envelope with the other. Dr. Elwood stepped aside. Whether from pity or shame, Ethan did not know. His mother called his name, sharp enough to crack through the room, but Ethan was already in the hallway, already moving past portraits and polished tables and every rule that had raised him to be obedient. At the top of the staircase, he paused only once, not to look back, but to press the envelope against his chest. For the first time in his life, Ethan Whitmore chose himself before anyone gave him permission. Ethan did not make it to the front door. The grand staircase curved down into the moonlit foyer, each marble step reflecting the pale blue glow from the security lights outside, and for a few breathless seconds he thought the house might actually let him go. Then the lock on the main entrance clicked. A quiet electronic sound. Small. Civilized. Devastating. Ethan stopped at the bottom of the stairs with his canvas bag gripped in one hand and the ultrasound envelope pressed flat beneath his coat. From behind him, Victoria's voice floated down from the second floor, smooth again now that control had returned to her reach. You are exhausted, Ethan. Do not turn one bad evening into a lifetime of consequences. He looked at the locked door, then at the side hallway leading to the service entrance. 2 household security staff appeared there, not threatening, not touching him, simply standing in the way with the uncomfortable expressions of people paid to obey wealthy families. Ethan's heart began to pound so hard it made him dizzy. The baby was still too small to move, but he felt an instinctive pull beneath his palm, as if his body had become a compass pointing only toward escape. Please, he said, not to his mother, but to the men blocking the hall. I need air. Neither of them moved. Victoria descended the staircase one measured step at a time. You need rest. Tomorrow we will discuss how to repair this. Repair. The word almost made him laugh. Before she reached the foyer, headlights swept across the frosted glass beside the door. A car had turned into the private drive. Everyone froze. The Whitmore estate did not receive unannounced guests after midnight. A moment later, the security intercom chimed, and the night guard's uncertain voice filled the foyer. Ma'am, Mr. Nathaniel Pierce is at the gate. He says he is here for Ethan. Victoria's face changed so quickly Ethan might have missed it if he had not been watching her. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Calculation. Annoyance. Nathaniel Pierce belonged to a rival family with enough money to be untouchable and enough influence to be inconvenient. He had been at the Harrington event that night, standing near the western archway when Caleb spoke those words that still echoed in Ethan's bones. Ethan remembered him only in fragments: dark blonde hair, gray eyes, a navy suit, a steady gaze that had not held pity. Victoria recovered first. "Tell him Ethan is unavailable." Ethan moved before thought could catch him. He crossed the foyer to the intercom and pressed the button with shaking fingers. "I am here." His mother's voice sharpened. "Ethan." But the damage was done. Static crackled, then Nathaniel's calm voice came through the speaker. "Are you safe?" The question was so simple that Ethan nearly broke from it. No one had asked him that tonight. Not if he was embarrassed. Not if he had ruined anything. Not if he understood the consequences. Safe. The word opened something raw and aching in him. He looked at the locked door, at the guards, at his mother's frozen smile. "I need to leave," he said. There was a pause, no longer than a heartbeat. "Then I will wait at the gate until you do." Victoria stepped close, her perfume cold and floral. "End this conversation now." Ethan turned to her slowly. He had spent 19 years shrinking beneath that tone. Tonight, his hand found a small curve beneath his coat, and he did not shrink. "Open the door. Do not be dramatic. Open the door, or I will tell Nathaniel Pierce exactly why you will not let me walk out." Silence fell so completely that even the security staff looked away. Victoria understood the threat. If Nathaniel learned enough to ask questions publicly, the Whitmore family could no longer control the story alone. Her mouth tightened. For a long moment, mother and son stared at each other across the polished foyer, one defending a name, the other defending a life. Then Victoria gave a tiny nod. The lock released. Ethan did not wait for permission twice. He opened the door and stepped into the cold night. The air struck his face clean and sharp, smelling of wet pavement, trimmed grass, and freedom so sudden it hurt. He walked down the long driveway under bare oak trees, every step carrying him farther from the house that had raised him like a possession. At the gate, a black sedan waited beneath the security lights. Nathaniel Pierce stood beside it with his coat open against the cold, tall and still, his gray eyes taking in Ethan's canvas bag, his pale face, the way one hand guarded his stomach. He did not ask the question his gaze had already answered. He simply removed his coat and held it out. Ethan hesitated. "I cannot explain everything tonight." Nathaniel's voice was quiet. "You do not have to." Ethan stared at him, waiting for the bargain, the demand, the clever smile of an alpha who saw weakness and wanted ownership. None came. Nathaniel only draped the coat carefully around his shoulders, keeping enough distance that Ethan could choose whether to step closer or away. The fabric was warm from his body and smelled faintly of clean smoke, rain, and black coffee. "You do not have to answer tonight," Nathaniel said. "You just have to breathe." Ethan's eyes filled again, but this time the tears did not feel like defeat. Behind him, the Whitmore estate glowed white and cold beyond the gate. Ahead of him, the car door stood open, and beyond that was a road he had never been allowed to take alone. He climbed into the back seat with the canvas bag on his lap and the ultrasound envelope held safely beneath both hands. As Nathaniel closed the door, Ethan looked once through the window at the mansion that had tried to rename his child before the world could know it existed. Then the sedan pulled away, and for the first time since the ballroom, Ethan let himself breathe. Caleb Harrington did not sleep after the announcement. He stood alone in his penthouse above downtown Chicago while the city glittered beneath him like a field of distant, indifferent stars, one hand braced against the glass and the other still carrying the faint warmth of Madison Vale's congratulatory touch. The engagement had been praised as elegant, strategic, inevitable. His father had called it a necessary victory. The board had called it stability. Reporters had already called it the union that would define the Harrington future. But every time Caleb closed his eyes, he did not see Madison's smile or the cameras flashing over champagne. He saw Ethan Whitmore in a cream coat, standing too still beneath the chandeliers, one hand pressed to his stomach as if holding himself together from the inside. "You were never meant to stand beside me." Caleb had said the words because his father had demanded a clean break. He had said them because the Harrington name was balanced on a merger worth billions, because Madison's family controlled votes his father needed, because he had been raised to understand that weakness became blood in the water. He had said them because, for one terrible moment, he had chosen the version of himself everyone expected over the person who had once made him feel human. But knowing why did not make the words less unforgivable. Near 2 a.m, his phone lit up with a message from his private driver. Mr. Harrington, there was unusual activity at the Whitmore estate. Mr. Nathaniel Pierce was seen leaving with Ethan Whitmore. Caleb read the message once. Then again. The name Nathaniel Pierce turned the guilt in his chest into something sharper. Pierce was not merely a rival. He was patient, respected, dangerous in the quiet way old money could be dangerous without ever raising its voice. Caleb called Ethan. It went straight to voicemail. He called again. Nothing. The third time, his grip tightened until the phone trembled in his hand. He told himself it was anger. He told himself it was pride. But beneath both was fear, sudden and clean. Ethan had looked too pale tonight. Too thin. Too fragile beneath that oversized coat. Caleb's memory caught on the gesture again, Ethan's hand guarding his stomach. A strange unease moved through him, not logical, not verbal, something deeper than thought. He grabbed his coat and left before sunrise. The Whitmore estate was quiet when he arrived. Its white exterior washed in gray morning light. Victoria Whitmore received him in the front parlor as if this were a social call instead of the wreckage of several lives. Her smile was composed, her tea untouched. Caleb. This is unexpected. Where is Ethan? Victoria folded her hands. Resting elsewhere. He was distraught after your announcement. The word distraught scraped against him. With Nathaniel Pierce? Her gaze flickered. It was tiny, but Caleb saw it. My son's emotional choices are no longer your concern. That should have ended the conversation. Caleb had made it true in front of half of Chicago. But then a faint scent reached him from the hallway beyond the parlor, caught in the fibers of a scarf hanging over the banister, soft and familiar beneath layers of lilies and polish. Ethan's scent had always carried white rose after rain, delicate but stubborn. This was different. Warmer. Rounder. Touched with something impossibly gentle, like milk warmed on a stove, like sunlight through clean cotton, like a nursery he had no right to imagine. Caleb stopped breathing. The room tilted so quietly that no one else noticed. His alpha instincts did not ask permission from logic. They recognized blood, bond, and beginning in a single breath. Caleb turned toward the hallway. Victoria rose at once. You should not go upstairs. He looked at her, and for the first time in his life, the Harrington mask failed completely. How long have you known? Her face went still. That was answer enough. Caleb walked past her before she could form another elegant lie. Ethan's room was at the end of the second-floor hall. The door was open. Inside, the bed was unmade, a drawer left half pulled out, a few sweaters missing from the closet. On the chair lay the cream coat from the ballroom. Caleb crossed to it slowly, as if approaching something sacred and ruined. The scent was stronger there, woven into the lining where Ethan's hand must have pressed again and again. White rose. Rain. Fear. And beneath it, unmistakable now, a tiny echo of Caleb's own cedarwood and winter air, softened into something new. His knees nearly gave beneath him. Not from weakness. From recognition. A child. Ethan was carrying his child. Caleb saw the ballroom again, but now every detail rearranged itself into a truth so cruel he could barely stand under it. Ethan's pale face. His guarded stomach. The question he had asked in front of everyone. What was I to you? Caleb had answered without knowing that two hearts were listening. On the dresser, tucked beneath a silver hairbrush, was a small square of fabric. A handkerchief, embroidered in careful blue thread with a single tiny star. Caleb picked it up, and the last of his control broke in silence. Behind him, Victoria said from the doorway, "It is better for everyone if you let him go." Caleb closed his fist around the little star and turned toward her with eyes that no longer belonged to the obedient Harrington heir. "No," he said, his voice quiet enough to frighten even himself. "It was better for everyone when I was blind." Caleb left the Whitmore estate with the embroidered star folded inside his coat pocket, but Ethan was already beyond the reach of apologies. Nathaniel's sedan had carried him north through the sleeping edges of Chicago, past closed coffee shops, empty gas stations, and neighborhoods where porch lights glowed like small promises in the dark. By sunrise, they reached a quiet lake town nearly 90 miles away, the kind of place Ethan had only seen in travel magazines left on waiting room tables. The streets were narrow and clean, the houses painted soft blue and white, and the air smelled of pine trees, cold water, and breakfast bread from a bakery opening early near the marina. Nathaniel owned a small guest cottage there, set back from the road behind a fence covered in bare winter vines. It was not grand. It did not have marble floors or portraits or a gate that locked from the inside. It had a yellow kitchen, a worn green sofa, and windows that looked toward the lake. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment, still wrapped in Nathaniel's coat, his canvas bag hanging from one shoulder, unable to understand why safety could feel so unfamiliar. "You can stay here as long as you need," Nathaniel said from behind him. "No staff. No reporters. No one comes here unless you invite them." Ethan turned, searching his face for the hidden cost. "Why are you helping me?" Nathaniel did not answer immediately. He looked toward the lake, where the morning light turned the water silver. "Because I saw a room full of people watch you break, and not one of them reached for you." The simplicity of it hurt more than suspicion would have. Ethan stepped inside before his knees could weaken. Hours passed strangely after that, soft and unreal. Nathaniel made toast and ginger tea without asking questions. Ethan changed into an oversized sweater from his bag and placed the ultrasound envelope on the kitchen table as if it were something fragile enough to bruise. The cottage was quiet in a way the Whitmore house had never been. There was no expectation inside the silence. No footsteps stopping outside his door. No voice correcting the shape of his grief. Only the ticking of a wall clock, the hum of the refrigerator, and the steady lake wind pressing gently against the windows. When Ethan finally sat on the sofa, exhaustion folded over him all at once. He rested one hand on his stomach and let his eyes close. For the first time since the ballroom, he did not dream of chandeliers. He dreamed of white roses growing wild beyond glass, and a tiny star floating above dark water. Back in Chicago, Caleb tore through the morning like a man arriving too late to every truth. He called Ethan again and again until voicemail became a punishment. He called Nathaniel Pierce and received no answer. He called in favors, rejected his father's demands, ignored Madison's messages, and sent drivers toward every property the Pierce family owned. None of it changed the one fact that mattered. Ethan had left because Caleb had taught him leaving was safer than staying. By afternoon, Caleb returned to his penthouse, not because he had given up, but because every search had become noise. He needed one clear thing. One thread. One reason Ethan might still believe he deserved to be found. In his pocket, the handkerchief with the blue star seemed impossibly small. He unfolded it on his desk and stared at the careful stitches until his vision blurred. He remembered Ethan's voice in the ballroom. "What was I to you?" He had answered like a coward trained to sound like a king. The next evening, at the lake cottage, Ethan woke to the sound of his phone vibrating inside his bag. Caleb's name lit the screen. Once. Twice. A third time. Nathaniel looked toward him from the kitchen but said nothing. Ethan picked up the phone, watched it tremble in his hand, and then let it go silent. A message appeared a moment later. "Please tell me where you are. I know now." Ethan's breath caught, but not with hope. With pain. Because knowing now did not erase not knowing then. Knowing now did not unmake the laughter, the cameras, the sentence that had cut him open in public. Ethan stood slowly, walked to the small writing desk by the window, and took out a sheet of paper from the drawer. His hand shook only once before he began to write. You rejected me in public. So I chose my child in silence. He folded the note, took a photograph of it, and sent it to Caleb without another word. Then he turned off the phone. In Chicago, Caleb received the image while standing alone beside the glass wall of his penthouse. The city stretched beneath him, bright and endless, offering everything except the one person he had lost.